Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Bourbon County, Kansas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1874, and the American frontier was still a place where a person could disappear without a trace, where the laws of civilization were tenuous at best, and where the vastness of the open prairie could swallow secrets whole. It was here, along the old military road connecting Fort Scott to the Oklahoma territories, that the Blackwood sisters established what locals called the Last Chance Inn, though its actual name, according to county records, was simply Blackwood House. What made this establishment particularly notable was not its remote location, though it stood isolated at a bend in the Marmaton River, nearly 15 miles from Fort Scott proper, but rather the peculiar reputation it developed among travelers. Those who survived to speak of it claimed the Blackwood sisters never served the same guest twice. At the time, most attributed this to poor hospitality or the transient nature of frontier establishments. The truth, as uncovered by historian Dr. Thomas Mercer in 1962, would prove far more disturbing. According to land records preserved in the Bourbon County Historical Society, Blackwood House was purchased in March of 1873 by Eliza Blackwood, age 32, and her younger sister Margaret, age 29. The sisters had arrived from Pennsylvania following the death of their father, a respectable businessman whose obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer made no mention of scandal or impropriety. What brought two unmarried women of seemingly good standing to the Kansas frontier remains a subject of speculation. The prevailing theory, supported by fragmentary correspondence, recovered from a lockbox during the demolition of the property in 1919, suggests they were fleeing something rather than pursuing opportunity. One letter fragment, dated January 1873, reads only, "They cannot follow us there. The distance alone shall provide protection, and what we build shall be impervious to their inquiries." Father would have understood the necessity. Another fragment addressed simply to E, and signed with the initial EM, presumably Margaret writing to her sister, reveals more of their mindset as they prepared to leave Pennsylvania. "I have sold the last of Mother's silver and secured an additional $800. Combined with what remains of our inheritance, we should have sufficient funds to establish ourselves properly. I have also obtained the documents we discussed, blank deeds, certificates, and letterhead, that may prove useful in creating the necessary legitimacy." The man who provided them asked no questions, though his eyes lingered overlong on my gloved hands. I believe he suspected something, but the additional $50 ensured his silence. This reference to documents suggests the sisters may have been planning some form of deception even before their arrival in Kansas, though the specific nature of their intentions remains unclear from the surviving fragments. The Blackwood sisters arrived in Fort Scott with considerable funds, unusual for single women of that era. They purchased not only the property that would become their infamous inn, but also secured a regular supply arrangement with merchants in Fort Scott, primarily dry goods, preserved meats, and unusually large quantities of lye soap and quicklime, according to quarterly order forms preserved in the mercantile ledgers of Hoffman & Sons, the primary supplier to the region at that time. The property they selected was significant, not merely for its isolation, which would later prove crucial to their activities, but for its history. According to county records examined by Dr. Mercer, the land had previously been owned by a homesteader named Jeremiah Wilkes, who had constructed a modest cabin and attempted to establish a farm there in 1867. Wilkes, his wife, and their farmhand had all perished during a harsh winter in 1870, reportedly of typhoid fever, though local rumors suggested foul play may have been involved. The property had remained vacant until the Blackwoods' purchase, considered by locals to be somehow tainted by tragedy. The sisters wasted no time in transforming the modest homestead into a more substantial establishment. Construction records filed with the county show they hired a crew from Fort Scott to expand the original cabin into a two-story main house and to build the separate guest cabins and outbuildings. Intriguingly, the foreman's logs indicate that the sisters frequently modified the architectural plans during construction, requesting additions and alterations that were not in the original specifications, particularly regarding cellars, drainage systems, and the unusual water delivery system that would later prove crucial to their methodology. What happened in the 16 months that followed forms the core of this disturbing narrative. Blackwood House stood at a strategic location. The military road connecting Fort Scott to Indian Territory saw regular traffic: soldiers, land speculators, displaced natives, and the occasional stagecoach. The establishment offered meals, modest accommodations, and stable facilities for those traveling the often treacherous route. According to advertisements placed in the Fort Scott Pioneer, the sisters offered hot meals, clean beds, and discretion for the discerning traveler. These advertisements, examined by Dr. Mercer during his research, evolved over the sisters' time in operation. The earliest simply announced the establishment of Blackwood House, lodging and meals for travelers, with basic information about location and rates. By late 1873, however, their marketing had become more targeted. One advertisement from November 1873 reads, "Blackwood House welcomes gentlemen of business and means traveling to or from the territories. Private accommodations, secure storage for valuables, and no questions asked. Reasonable rates for those who value privacy and comfort on the frontier." This shift in advertising strategy suggests the sisters had refined their target clientele, specifically men traveling alone, likely carrying valuables, and with reason to value discretion and privacy. It was this last promise, discretion, that perhaps attracted a certain type of clientele. The post-Civil War frontier was populated with individuals seeking to escape their past. Confederate sympathizers, deserters from both armies, those fleeing debts or legal troubles in the East, all found the territories a convenient place to reinvent themselves, often under assumed names. The sisters seemed to understand this market well. Unlike other establishments that required guests to sign ledgers or provide identification, the Blackwoods reportedly asked few questions and offered private accommodations separated from the main house. 6 individual cabins arranged in a half-circle behind the main structure, each with its own entrance, and no connecting doors or windows, according to architectural plans filed with the county when the property was renovated. These cabins, modest in appearance from the exterior, offered surprising comfort by frontier standards. According to descriptions provided by James Whitfield, one of the few known guests to stay at Blackwood House and survive the experience, each cabin contained not only the expected bed and washstand, but also a writing desk, comfortable chair, small bookshelf with various volumes, and even framed artwork, amenities that would have been unusual for remote accommodations in that era. It was as if a room from a fine Eastern hotel had been transported to the middle of nowhere, Whitfield later recalled in his statement to authorities. The bed linens were of good quality, the furnishings solid, if not new, and everything meticulously clean. Most surprising was the availability of hot water on demand, a luxury I had not expected to find so far from civilization. This attention to comfort likely served 2 purposes: to attract a more affluent clientele and to ensure guests would use the water system that the sisters had designed as the first stage of their deadly methodology. Local residents had minimal contact with the Blackwood sisters. They visited Fort Scott monthly to purchase supplies and attend to banking matters, but rarely socialized. Their appearance, described in a diary entry from Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, wife of the merchant who supplied their goods, paints a picture of rigid propriety. The elder Miss Blackwood wears her hair severely pinned, her clothing immaculate, though dated by perhaps a decade. She speaks with precision and authority. The younger sister rarely speaks at all, but watches everything with an intensity that borders on inappropriate. They decline all invitations to social functions, yet maintain impeccable manners. There is something in their demeanor that suggests they are perpetually on guard, though against what I cannot say. Further descriptions of the sisters appear in various accounts collected by Dr. Mercer during his research. A bank teller named William Porter, who regularly handled their financial transactions, described Eliza as formidable in her composure, always dressed in dark colors, her face betraying no emotion save occasional contempt when forced to interact with others she clearly deemed beneath her notice. Margaret, by contrast, was described as mouse-like in public, always slightly behind her sister, yet with eyes that missed nothing. On the one occasion when Eliza stepped away to speak with the bank manager, leaving Margaret alone at my window, her demeanor changed entirely, becoming almost predatory in its focus, asking pointed questions about the bank's other customers that were most inappropriate. The layout of Blackwood House itself, according to architectural drawings preserved in county records, suggested careful planning beyond the typical frontier establishment. The main house was a substantial two-story structure with an unusual number of storage areas, including an expanded root cellar that, according to later investigation, had been significantly reinforced and modified after the initial construction. The guest cabins were positioned to be visible from the main house, but not from one another, ensuring privacy but also isolation for each visitor. A separate building housed the kitchen and dining area, connected to the main house by a covered walkway that allowed service regardless of weather conditions. Most noteworthy was the property's water system, unusually sophisticated for a frontier establishment. The sisters had commissioned the installation of a pump system drawing from the Marmaton River, with pipes leading not only to the main house and kitchen, but to each individual cabin. This convenience would have been remarkable for travelers accustomed to communal washing facilities, and possibly served as an additional attraction for a more affluent clientele. What few realized at the time, and what Lieutenant Prescott's investigation would later reveal, was that this water system had been specifically designed with sinister intent. Each cabin's supply could be individually controlled from a central location in the main house cellar, where a system of valves and a reservoir containing laudanum and other sedatives allowed the sisters to drug specific guests while leaving others unaffected. The first indication that something was amiss at Blackwood House came in late autumn of 1873, when a land surveyor named James Whitfield reported an unusual experience to the sheriff of Bourbon County. According to the official report, filed and later preserved in the county archives, Whitfield had stayed at the establishment while mapping the Southern Territories. He described excellent service and unusual attentiveness from the sisters, particularly the younger Margaret, who seemed especially concerned with his future travel plans and whether anyone knew of his whereabouts. Whitfield's full account, recorded by Sheriff Daniel Matthews, provides disturbing details about the sisters' methodology that would later be corroborated by evidence found during Prescott's investigation. Miss Margaret seemed particularly interested in my profession, asking detailed questions about my surveying work, my employers, and whether I was expected to report to anyone upon completion of my assignment. At the time, I attributed this to mere conversational interest, though in retrospect, her questions were unusually specific regarding dates, locations, and who might come looking for me if I were delayed. He further noted that during dinner, served in the main house dining room rather than his cabin, Eliza Blackwood had asked pointed questions about his financial arrangements, including how he was paid, whether he carried significant sums, and if he maintained accounts with banks in Fort Scott or elsewhere. Again, at the time, he had thought little of these inquiries, assuming they reflected the practical concerns of frontier business operators who needed to know if their guests could pay for extended stays. What troubled Whitfield was not his stay itself, but rather what he observed upon returning to the main road the following morning. From an elevated position approximately half a mile from the property, he claimed to have witnessed the sisters dragging what appeared to be a heavy trunk from one of the guest cabins to an outbuilding near the river. When he returned to the establishment 3 weeks later, having completed his survey work, the sisters claimed to have no rooms available, despite visible vacancies. When he insisted he had stayed previously, the elder Miss Blackwood reportedly stated, "We have no record of your previous visit, sir, and we certainly have no accommodations for you now." In his statement to Sheriff Matthews, Whitfield recalled the chill that ran through him at her denial. It was not merely that she claimed to have no record of my stay. It was the way her eyes held mine as she spoke, daring me to contradict her. Behind her, Miss Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway, partially concealed, but watching intently. Her hand was hidden in the folds of her skirt, and I had the distinct impression she was holding something, a knife, perhaps, or some other weapon. The sense of threat was palpable, though nothing explicit was said. Whitfield, perceiving potential danger, chose not to press the matter. He returned to Fort Scott and reported his experience, but Sheriff Matthews, limited by resources and jurisdiction, simply made note of the account without further investigation. The sheriff's log entry dismisses Whitfield's concerns as likely a misunderstanding or perhaps a means of avoiding an unpaid lodging bill, a tragic misreading that may have cost many lives in the months that followed. This account might have been dismissed as the misunderstanding of a weary traveler had it not been corroborated by similar reports in the months that followed. A cattle driver named Eustace Montgomery reported to a saloon keeper in Fort Scott that he had been turned away from Blackwood House despite having stayed there comfortably just 2 months prior. According to Montgomery, when he reminded Eliza Blackwood of his previous visit and the specific room he had occupied, she responded with a chilling statement. "Sir, you are mistaken. No one who has stayed in cabin 4 has ever returned to our establishment." The saloon keeper, Joseph Miller, recorded this curious interaction in his personal journal, noting, "Montgomery seemed genuinely puzzled by the woman's denial. He insisted he had left behind a silver tobacco case during his previous stay and wished to inquire about it. When he pressed the matter, he claims the younger sister emerged from the kitchen with a hand conspicuously hidden in her apron pocket, at which point the elder suggested he leave immediately if he wished to reach his destination by nightfall." Miller's journal, discovered among his effects after his death in 1888 and eventually acquired by the Kansas Historical Society, contains several other references to travelers mentioning unusual experiences at Blackwood House. One entry from February 1874 records a conversation with a timber merchant who described feeling unusually drowsy after drinking water in his cabin, despite having been well rested upon arrival. He had awakened the next morning to find his cabin door locked from the outside, which the sisters explained as a safety measure during an overnight windstorm. More disturbing was his discovery that his saddlebags had been searched, though nothing appeared to be missing. Another entry, dated April 1874, mentions a conversation with a man identified only as J.S., who claimed to have seen human bones in a quicklime pit behind the stables while retrieving his horse early one morning. When he questioned Eliza Blackwood about this discovery, she explained they had recently slaughtered a steer for meat and disposed of the remains there. The man, though skeptical, did not pursue the matter further, being eager to continue his journey. Montgomery reportedly complied with this suggestion, finding something in the women's demeanor that discouraged further inquiry. He later told Miller he had the distinct impression that something unnatural was occurring at that place, and that he would avoid the establishment in future travels, even if it meant sleeping under the stars. By spring of 1874, local merchants began noting the sisters' unusual purchasing patterns. In addition to their regular orders, they frequently bought men's clothing, boots, pocket watches, and personal effects. Items they explained were necessities for guests who arrive unprepared for frontier conditions. More concerning was their increasing orders for quicklime and their purchase of a bone saw, which they claimed was needed for processing game meat, though neither sister was known to hunt. Hoffman's ledgers, preserved in the county historical archives, show regular purchases of men's attire in various sizes, typically ordered in quantities that suggested retail, rather than specific guest requirements. When questioned about this by Hoffman himself, Eliza Blackwood reportedly explained that travelers often arrived with insufficient or damaged clothing, having underestimated the rigors of frontier travel. The sisters, she claimed, maintained a small stock of necessary items for purchase, providing a service to their customers while creating an additional revenue stream for their business. This explanation satisfied Hoffman, who noted in his business journal that the Blackwood sisters showed remarkable entrepreneurial spirit for their sex, and suggested other establishments might benefit from similar diversification. More disturbing, in retrospect, was their steadily increasing orders for chemicals, particularly lye, quicklime, and various acids ostensibly used for cleaning. The quantities, according to Hoffman's records, far exceeded what would be necessary for normal household maintenance, even for an establishment serving multiple guests. When his clerk questioned one particularly large order in April 1874, Margaret Blackwood reportedly replied that frontier standards of cleanliness require frontier measures of purification. The sisters' banking activities during this period, documented in records examined by Dr. Mercer, show a pattern consistent with their criminal enterprise. Their account, opened upon arrival in Fort Scott with an initial deposit of approximately $3,000, a substantial sum in that era, showed regular deposits throughout their 16 months of operation. These deposits, ranging from $50 to $500, were made in cash rather than bank drafts or checks, unusual for legitimate business income in that period. More telling was their purchase of multiple small safes delivered to the property, 3 in total, according to delivery records from a Fort Scott hardware merchant. Such security measures would have been excessive for a small frontier inn, suggesting they were accumulating valuables beyond what would be expected from legitimate business operations. The turning point in the Blackwood case came in July of 1874, when a military patrol led by Lieutenant Walter Prescott stopped at the inn while investigating the disappearance of a government land agent named Samuel Hollister. Hollister had last been seen departing Fort Scott for the Oklahoma Territories and had mentioned plans to stay at Blackwood House, according to his written itinerary found among his effects at the fort. Prescott, a meticulous officer with experience in intelligence operations during the Civil War, approached the investigation with particular attention to detail. His military records, accessed by Dr. Mercer in the 1960s, reveal that Hollister's disappearance was especially concerning due to the sensitive nature of the documents he had been carrying, surveys of Indian territory that were relevant to pending government negotiations with displaced tribes. Prescott's personal journal, discovered among his effects donated to the Kansas Military Historical Society, reveals his immediate suspicions upon arriving at Blackwood House. There is something not right about these women. The elder, Miss Eliza, speaks with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to deception. She maintains eye contact too deliberately, as if consciously performing sincerity rather than naturally exhibiting it. The younger sister watches from doorways, her gaze calculating. The establishment itself is too refined for its location, suggesting a purpose beyond mere hospitality. I have instructed the men to maintain vigilance and to accept no food or drink while we are here. Lieutenant Prescott's official report, sealed until 1957 and only discovered during a military archives review at Fort Leavenworth, describes his interaction with the sisters as professional but evasive. When shown a daguerreotype of Hollister, both sisters denied ever having seen the man. However, a private under Prescott's command reported observing what appeared to be Hollister's distinctive monogrammed valise in a storage room while being shown to the water closet. The private, identified in Prescott's journal as Corporal James Sullivan, had been deliberately sent to request use of the facilities, a strategic move by Prescott to allow examination of areas not normally accessible to visitors. Sullivan's discovery of the valise, which bore the initials S.H. and the Department of the Interior seal, provided the first concrete evidence linking the missing agent to Blackwood House. When confronted with this information, Eliza Blackwood reportedly produced documents showing the bag had been purchased from a traveling salesman. The hasty explanation might have sufficed had Prescott not noticed Margaret wearing a unique watch fob that matched the description of one known to belong to Hollister, a gift from the Department of the Interior bearing its seal. Prescott's journal describes the moment of confrontation. When presented with the evidence of Corporal Sullivan's discovery, Miss Eliza maintained her composure admirably, producing a bill of sale that appeared authentic at first glance. It was only upon closer examination that I noticed the ink was still relatively fresh, suggesting recent creation. More damning was Miss Margaret's evident nervousness. She repeatedly touched a watch fob, partially concealed in her pocket, unconsciously drawing my attention to it. When I requested to examine this item, their facade of cooperation instantly vanished. According to Prescott's report, Eliza attempted to terminate the conversation, claiming they had business to attend to in the kitchen. When Prescott insisted on examining the watch fob, Margaret fled to the upper floor of the main house, while Eliza produced a small Derringer pistol from her pocket. The ensuing confrontation was brief. Corporal Sullivan disarmed Eliza while Prescott and two other soldiers pursued Margaret, who had attempted to destroy documents in a small stove in her bedroom. Prescott detained the sisters for questioning and ordered a search of the property. What his men discovered in the root cellar of the main house and in a lime pit behind the stables was described in his report as evidence of systematic and prolonged disposal of human remains. Excavation revealed bone fragments, personal effects, and at least 17 distinct belt buckles, pocket watches, and wedding rings, suggesting a significant number of victims. The most disturbing discovery, however, was a leather-bound ledger found concealed in Eliza Blackwood's bedroom. Unlike standard guest registers of the era, this book contained detailed information about each visitor, physical descriptions, estimated wealth, stated destinations, and whether anyone knew of their whereabouts. Each entry concluded with a simple notation, processed or released, followed by a date. Of the 64 entries recorded between April 1873 and July 1874, 51 were marked processed. The ledger, portions of which were transcribed in Prescott's report and later published in Dr. Mercer's monograph, reveals the calculated nature of the sisters' operation. Each entry followed a consistent format, beginning with a date and the guest's name, or in some cases, merely a description if the name was unknown or believed to be false. This was followed by estimated age, occupation, stated destination, and apparent wealth, categorized as minimal, modest, substantial, or, in a few cases, exceptional. Most disturbing were the sections titled Connections and Expected Elsewhere, which documented whether the guest had mentioned family, business associates, or anyone who might inquire about their whereabouts if they disappeared. Those entries marked no known connections or not expected elsewhere were invariably followed by the notation processed. Those with significant connections were typically marked released, suggesting the sisters were calculating the risk of discovery against the potential gain from each murder. A typical entry dated September 12, 1873 reads, Male guest approx. 40 years, claims name Robert Williams, likely false. Cattle buyer returning from Oklahoma Territory. Wealth substantial, carrying approx. $200 in bank drafts and $300 cash. Connections, none stated, wears no wedding ring, mentioned no family. Expected elsewhere, claims to be expected in Wichita by month's end, but no specific appointments mentioned. Assessment, low risk. Decision, process. The search of the property revealed an operation of disturbing sophistication. The guest cabins, while appearing comfortable and conventional, contained several hidden features, According to Prescott's report, each cabin was equipped with what he described as a system for observation and potential incapacitation of occupants. Small viewing ports had been disguised as decorative elements in the cabin walls, allowing surveillance from the exterior. More alarmingly, the water system, previously noted as unusually advanced for a frontier establishment, included mechanisms by which sedatives could potentially be introduced into the water supply of individual cabins. Analysis of residue found in these pipes, conducted by an Army physician accompanying Prescott's unit, indicated the presence of laudanum and other soporific compounds. The implication was clear. Guests could be rendered unconscious through their drinking water, making them vulnerable to whatever processing the sisters had planned. The cabins themselves showed evidence of meticulous cleaning, unusual for frontier accommodations where standards were typically relaxed. Flooring in several cabins had been recently replaced, and walls showed signs of having been repeatedly scrubbed with chemical solutions. Most tellingly, Cabin 4, mentioned specifically in Eustace Montgomery's account, contained a trapdoor beneath the bed, leading to a crawl space that connected to a tunnel running toward the main house. This tunnel, large enough for 2 people to move through while dragging a third, showed signs of frequent use. The earthen floor was compacted from passage, and along the sides were found several personal items presumed to have been dropped during transport: a cufflink, a pipe stem, and, most damning, a military identification tag belonging to a sergeant reported missing 3 months earlier. The processing area itself, located in an expanded section of the root cellar, contained equipment that Prescott's report describes in clinical terms, but which must have presented a horrific scene. A large drain in the center of the stone floor led to a pipe running to the river. Chains attached to the walls suggested victims were restrained, perhaps while the sisters determined what valuables they possessed or waited for any drugs to wear off for questioning. Various implements, including knives, saws, and specialized tools of uncertain purpose, were found neatly arranged on a workbench along one wall. Adjacent to this area was a smaller room that appeared to serve as a sorting space for victims' possessions. Clothing was separated by type and size, presumably for later resale. Personal effects, such as watches, jewelry, and documents, were organized in labeled drawers. Financial instruments, including bank drafts, bonds, and certificates, were stored in a small safe, the contents of which totaled over $15,000 according to Prescott's inventory. What motivated the Blackwood sisters remained speculative until the discovery in 1962 of a hidden compartment in an antique writing desk that had once belonged to Eliza Blackwood. The desk, having passed through several owners, had ended up in the collection of the Kansas Historical Society. During restoration, conservators discovered a false bottom containing a sealed packet of letters. These letters, exchanged between Eliza and a person identified only as M.R. in Philadelphia, suggested that the sisters had fled east after discovering their father had been systematically defrauded by a ring of confidence men, leading to his financial ruin and subsequent suicide. The final letter, dated February 1873, contained a list of names and descriptions, men who had allegedly participated in the scheme, and a disturbing closing line: "Justice will find them, whether through courts or through your proposed alternative means. I cannot condone your methods, but neither can I condemn them, given what these men have done." The implication was clear. The Blackwood sisters had established their remote inn as a trap for the type of men who had destroyed their father: traveling businessmen, land speculators, and those trading in promises and investments. But as their ledger revealed, their vengeance had expanded well beyond the original list of targets. The correspondence, extensively analyzed by Dr. Mercer and later by forensic psychologist Dr. Eleanor Harrington, reveals the evolution of what began as targeted revenge into something more systematic and ideological. Early letters focus specifically on the men who defrauded their father, with detailed descriptions and information about their known travel patterns. Later communications, however, broadened to discuss categories of men deemed parasites upon honest society, language that would later appear in Eliza's courtroom defense. Further insight into their motivations came from a journal found hidden in a hollowed-out Bible in Margaret's room. The entries, written in a precise hand with occasional lapses into frantic scribbling, revealed a woman consumed by the belief that her mission was divinely ordained. "We are instruments of righteous retribution," she wrote in one entry dated December 1873. "Each man who enters our domain undergoes judgment. Some, the innocent, are sent forth unharmed. Others, those marked by greed and deceit, are removed from the world they have corrupted. Their possessions, earned through dishonesty, fund our continued work. It is perfect justice." The journal contained disturbing references to the processing, apparently Margaret's preferred term for their murders. She described in clinical detail the methods they had refined: the drugged water, the observation of the victim's collapse, the retrieval through the hidden tunnels, and finally what she called the separation, presumably the dismemberment and disposal of bodies. Most chilling were her descriptions of watching potential victims, assessing them for what she termed signs of corruption. These included ostentatious displays of wealth, boastful talk of business dealings, or any mention of investment schemes or land speculation. According to her writings, these characteristics marked men as deserving of processing, regardless of whether they had any connection to their father's ruin. The journal also reveals that Margaret, not Eliza, may have been the driving force behind their expanded killing beyond their original targets. While early entries suggest Eliza was hesitant to murder men not on their list of their father's defrauders, Margaret's writings indicate she convinced her sister that their sacred work required broader application. "He still harbors unnecessary reservations," one entry notes. "She fails to see that they are all branches of the same poisonous tree. I have shown her that our mission cannot be so narrowly defined if true justice is to be served." Following their arrest, the sisters were transported to Topeka for trial. Newspaper accounts described them as unnervingly composed throughout the proceedings. Eliza Blackwood, serving as their own defense, argued that they had provided a public service by eliminating society's parasites and those who prey upon the honest and hard-working. Margaret never spoke during the trial, maintaining what observers described as an unsettling smile throughout the proceedings. Court transcripts, rediscovered by Dr. Mercer and published in part in his 1963 monograph on frontier crime, reveal Eliza's disturbing eloquence in defending their actions. "Gentlemen of the jury," she reportedly stated in her closing argument, "you sit in judgment of us today, but we have sat in judgment of far more dangerous predators. Every man we removed from this world was a destroyer of lives himself, through financial ruin, through broken promises, through the slow violence of fraud and deceit. How many wives were widowed by their schemes before we intervened? How many found themselves destitute, as we did? How many fathers, like our own, saw no recourse but to end their lives when everything they had built was stolen through cunning paperwork and false assurances?" The prosecutor, District Attorney William Hardwick, countered by focusing on victims who clearly had no connection to the original motivation. His closing argument, preserved in the trial transcript, emphasized the expanding nature of their crimes. Whatever sympathetic understanding one might feel for the tragic circumstances that initially drove these women, the evidence shows they quickly transcended any notion of specific revenge. Their own records indicate they murdered men whose only crime was carrying cash, wearing a fine watch, or simply having no one who would immediately miss them. This was not justice. It was opportunistic predation disguised as righteous vengeance. The jury, comprised entirely of men, as was standard practice in that era, deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict. The judge, noting the cold calculation and absence of womanly remorse displayed by the defendants, sentenced both to death by hanging, an unusual punishment for female offenders in that period. Both sisters were found guilty of multiple counts of murder in October 1874. They were sentenced to hang, one of the few instances of women receiving capital punishment in that era. However, they would never face the gallows. On the night before their scheduled execution, the sisters disappeared from their cells. The circumstances of their escape remain contested. Official reports indicate that a guard was found unconscious, having been poisoned through what was believed to be contaminated food. Other accounts suggest possible outside assistance, though no accomplices were ever identified. The prison records examined by Dr. Mercer during his research reveal several curious details about the escape. The guard who was found unconscious had been assigned to the sisters' cell block just 2 days prior, replacing a veteran officer who had fallen ill with symptoms similar to those later exhibited by the poisoned guard. This suggests the possibility that the sisters had orchestrated the guard rotation, perhaps poisoning the first guard to ensure a less experienced replacement. More intriguing was the discovery, noted in the warden's personal log but omitted from official reports, that the cell door had been opened with a key rather than forced, implying either that the sisters had somehow obtained a duplicate key or that someone with access had assisted their escape. The warden's entry, dated November 5, 1874, reads, "I cannot account for how they acquired means of unlocking their cell. No keys are missing from our inventory, and no evidence of tampering with the lock mechanism is apparent. It is as if they simply walked out, though this is plainly impossible." Also suspicious was the timing of their escape, coinciding with a severe thunderstorm that had caused power outages throughout Topeka and reduced visibility to near zero. The timing suggested not opportunism, but planning, raising questions about how the sisters could have anticipated the weather conditions or coordinated their escape to coincide with them. Investigations in the weeks following their disappearance revealed several disquieting facts. A dressmaker in Topeka reported having been commissioned by a Mrs. Wilson to create 2 traveling outfits in styles distinctly different from the severe, old-fashioned clothing the Blackwood sisters typically wore. The commission had been placed nearly a month before their escape, suggesting long-term planning. Additionally, a teller at First Bank of Topeka recalled a woman matching Eliza's description, though using a different name, who had converted a substantial sum to gold coins approximately 2 weeks before the escape. The last confirmed sighting of the Blackwood sisters was reported by a station master in St. Louis, who claimed to have seen 2 women matching their description boarding an eastbound train in November 1874. They were reportedly traveling under the names Mrs. Eleanor Palmer and Mrs. Virginia Palmer, posing as widows returning to family in New York. The station master's account, detailed in a letter to Kansas authorities, described the women as dressed in the finest mourning clothes, with heavy veils that partially obscured their features. The elder carried herself with remarkable dignity, while the younger seemed almost giddy, laughing softly behind her veil as they boarded. They were accompanied by substantial luggage, 3 large trunks that required 2 porters to manage. When asked about the weight, the elder woman explained they were carrying family heirlooms too precious to leave behind. They tipped the porters generously with gold coins. What became of them after this point remains one of the most enduring mysteries of frontier criminal history. Unsubstantiated reports place them in locations as diverse as New Orleans, Boston, and even London in the years that followed. One persistent rumor, documented in the personal papers of a Pennsylvania state legislator in 1886, claimed the sisters had established a boarding house for gentlemen travelers in Pittsburgh under assumed names, though investigations at the time found no conclusive evidence. A curious footnote appears in the records of the Baltimore Police Department from 1879. A detective investigating the disappearance of 3 businessmen noted similarities in each case. All had last been seen at a boarding house operated by 2 sisters, possibly in their 30s, one severe in manner, the other watchful but rarely speaking. By the time police visited the establishment, the proprietors had departed, leaving behind only recently cleaned rooms and, according to the report, a lingering chemical smell suggestive of hospital wards. The property that had been Blackwood House was seized by Bourbon County authorities and remained abandoned for decades, becoming the subject of local superstition and rumors. When finally demolished in 1919 to make way for agricultural development, workers reported finding additional human remains in the foundations and under the floorboards of the main structure, though these claims were never officially documented. Local legend, recorded by folklorist Samuel Wilson in his 1935 collection Frontier Hauntings and Myths, holds that the land where Blackwood House stood remained barren for years after the structures were removed. Crops planted there withered, and livestock refused to graze on the property. While likely apocryphal, these stories reflect the lasting impact the Blackwood case had on the collective imagination of the region. Perhaps more credible are accounts from the construction crew that demolished the property. The foreman's log, preserved in the Bourbon County Historical Society, notes, "Upon removal of the main house flooring, we discovered what appears to be a secondary cellar not documented in the architectural plans. This space, approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, contained several trunks and a substantial quantity of quicklime. County authorities have been notified, and work has been temporarily suspended pending their investigation." The subsequent investigation, conducted by Sheriff Thomas Lawson, revealed that the hidden cellar had been used for what he described in his report as storage of personal effects, presumably belonging to victims. The trunks contained clothing, documents, and personal items that could have belonged to dozens of different individuals. Most disturbing was the discovery of a set of surgical implements carefully maintained and stored in a purpose-built case of fine leather. Lawson's report, filed with county authorities but never published in newspapers of the time, described additional discoveries that expanded understanding of the Blackwoods operation. Behind a false wall in the root cellar, we discovered what appears to be a record-keeping area. A desk containing ledgers older than the one previously discovered shows that the sisters may have begun their activities immediately upon taking possession of the property, rather than after a period of establishment, as previously believed. These earlier records are less organized, but suggest an additional 12 to 15 victims not accounted for in Lieutenant Prescott's investigation. The case of the Blackwood sisters represents a rare documented instance of female serial killers operating in the American frontier, made more unusual by their methodology and apparent motivation. Unlike other notorious killers of the era who typically targeted the vulnerable or those unlikely to be missed, the Blackwoods specifically selected victims whose disappearance would likely be noticed eventually, but in locations and circumstances where investigation would be difficult. Their approach, using hospitality as a lure and maintaining meticulous records, suggests a calculated business-like approach to murder that forensic psychologists would later identify as characteristic of mission-oriented killers. They viewed their actions not as crimes, but as corrections to a system they perceived as fundamentally corrupt. Dr. Mercer's research in the 1960s included correspondence with Dr. Eleanor Harrington, one of the first female forensic psychologists to study serial murder. Her assessment of the Blackwood case, included as an appendix to Mercer's monograph, provides valuable insight into the sisters' psychology. What distinguishes the Blackwood sisters from other documented female killers of the period is their complete absence of emotional involvement with their victims. Typical female murderers of the era killed those with whom they had personal relationships, husbands, lovers, family members, and generally employed poison as their method, avoiding direct physical confrontation. The Blackwoods, by contrast, killed strangers in a methodical, almost industrial fashion, and their method required direct physical intervention in the form of dismemberment and disposal. This suggests a level of detachment more commonly associated with male serial killers. The sisters appear to have completely dehumanized their victims, viewing them not as individuals, but as representatives of a class they deemed deserving of elimination. Their processing terminology further reinforces this detachment, the language of industry or butchery rather than murder. Most telling is their selection process. The released notations in their ledger indicate that they did not kill indiscriminately, but rather made judgments based on some internal criteria. This selective approach, combined with their apparent belief in the righteousness of their actions, suggests a mission-oriented typology, killers who believe they are performing a service to society by eliminating those they deem undesirable or harmful. In her analysis, Dr. Harrington further noted the unusual relationship between the sisters. The evidence suggests a symbiotic partnership, with Eliza providing the intellectual justification and public face of their operation, while Margaret appears to have been the more psychologically disturbed, possibly deriving direct satisfaction from the acts of killing. The journal entries suggest Margaret was the driving force behind expanding their targets beyond the original list, indicating an evolution from revenge to something closer to ideological killing, murdering not specific men who had wronged them, but any man who represented the type they despised. Perhaps most disturbing is the possibility that they continued their activities elsewhere after their escape. Several unsolved disappearances of traveling businessmen in the northeastern United States between 1875 and 1890 bear striking similarities to the Blackwood pattern, though direct connections were never established. A particularly suspicious cluster of disappearances occurred in the Boston area between 1880 and 1882. According to police records accessed by Dr. Mercer, 6 businessmen involved in land speculation or investment services vanished without trace after mentioning plans to stay at a boarding house operated by 2 sisters of mature years in the Back Bay area. When police investigated, they found the establishment recently closed and the proprietors gone, leaving no forwarding address. The Boston police files examined by Dr. Mercer during his research contain a curious detail not included in his published work, but mentioned in his private notes archived at the University of Kansas. An officer investigating the boarding house after the proprietor's departure reported finding unusual modifications to the plumbing system, including a central mechanism by which substances could be introduced into the water supply of individual rooms, remarkably similar to the system discovered at Blackwood House years earlier. Similar patterns emerged in Baltimore, 1877-1879, Philadelphia, 1883-1884, and most notably Montreal, 1885-1888, where authorities eventually connected at least 9 disappearances to a guest house called Widow's Rest, operated by women matching the Blackwoods' description. In each case, by the time authorities developed suspicions, the women had vanished, often leaving behind cleared-out properties, with unusual modifications to plumbing, drainage systems, or cellar spaces. The Montreal case is particularly well documented thanks to the meticulous investigation conducted by Detective Henri Beaumont of the Montreal Police. His files, preserved in the Quebec Provincial Archives and discovered by Dr. Mercer in 1967, revealed disturbing parallels to the original Blackwood operation. Widow's Rest, established in 1885 by 2 American women, using the names Elizabeth and Mary Wilson, catered specifically to businessmen traveling alone. Its advertising emphasized privacy and discretion, and it quickly developed a reputation for comfort and cleanliness unusual for establishments of its type. Beaumont's investigation, launched after the disappearance of a prominent banker named Thomas Fleming in 1887, uncovered modifications to the property similar to those found at Blackwood House. Observation ports disguised as decorative elements, an unusual water system that could be manipulated from a central location, and most damning, a hidden room in the cellar where traces of blood and quicklime were discovered despite evident attempts at thorough cleaning. The final piece of the Blackwood mystery emerged in 1965 when a descendant of Lieutenant Prescott donated his personal effects to the Kansas Military Historical Society. Among Prescott's papers was a sealed envelope marked Blackwood Confession, not to be opened until 1950. Inside was a handwritten letter purportedly from Eliza Blackwood, postmarked from Montreal in 1882. The letter, its authenticity never conclusively verified but generally accepted by historians, offered no apology for the sisters' actions, but rather a justification and a warning. The most chilling passage reads, "We have found that our work is not only necessary, but unending. The same parasites that destroyed our father continue to thrive throughout this land. They wear respectability like a costume, while they rob and ruin with impunity. We have simply become the consequence they never expected to face. And we remain vigilant, Lieutenant. In fact, we have expanded our establishment considerably. So many travelers need accommodations after all. And we never ever serve the same guest twice." The letter continued with details that only someone intimate with the original crimes could have known. Specifics about the property, about Prescott's investigation, and about the sisters' methodology that had never been publicly disclosed. It concluded with a passage that suggests the sisters had developed an almost philosophical justification for their continuing crimes. Society functions through unspoken agreement, that consequences follow actions, that debts must be paid, that harm invites response. When the machinery of justice fails, as it did for our father, new mechanisms must emerge to maintain this balance. We have become such a mechanism. Do not waste resources searching for us, Lieutenant. We are merely correcting an imbalance in the ledger of justice. Each life we take represents dozens saved from ruin. It is mathematics, not malice. Prescott's own notation on the envelope, dated 1883, reads simply, "I believe this communication to be genuine. God help us all." No further communication from either Blackwood sister was ever documented. If the letter is authentic, it suggests they continued their murderous enterprise for at least 8 years after their escape, having relocated to Canada and possibly established another deadly lodging house. The case files were officially closed in 1900, when both sisters would have been in their late 50s, presumed either dead or permanently beyond the reach of American law enforcement. The total number of their victims remains unknown, with estimates ranging from the confirmed 51 documented in their ledger to potentially over 100 if they continued their activities after their escape. A curious footnote to this final sighting emerged during Dr. Mercer's research in the 1960s. While examining archives in Montreal, he discovered a property deed dated 1895 for a small farm in rural Quebec purchased by Eleanor and Virginia Palmer, the aliases the sisters had used while fleeing Kansas. The timing coincides with their disappearance from Montreal following police interest in their boarding house. The property, approximately 30 miles from Quebec City, was remote and self-sufficient with its own well-substantial gardens and outbuildings. Local church records indicate that 2 American women lived there until approximately 1905, when they apparently ceased attending services or engaging with the community. No death records exist for either woman, nor any documentation of property transfer or abandonment. When Mercer visited the location in 1967, he found the original farmhouse long since collapsed, with only the stone foundation remaining. Local residents recalled stories of les deux sœurs américaines, who kept to themselves and discouraged visitors, but had no information about their ultimate fate. The most plausible theory, according to Mercer's final assessment, is that the Blackwood sisters, if the Quebec women were indeed them, finally succumbed to natural causes in their remote farmhouse, perhaps dying within a short time of each other, as sisters often do. With no family or close associates, their deaths would have gone unreported, their remains perhaps buried on the property by the surviving sister, and eventually their existence simply forgotten. What makes the Blackwood case particularly unsettling is not merely the number of victims, but the sisters' apparent belief in the righteousness of their actions. They viewed themselves not as murderers, but as judges and executioners, operating outside a legal system they had deemed ineffective. Their meticulous record-keeping and selective targeting suggests they saw themselves as providing a public service, eliminating those they deemed parasitic to society. This distorted sense of justice, combined with their ability to maintain an outward appearance of respectable propriety, allowed them to operate undetected for over a year in a relatively small community. It raises uncomfortable questions about how easily such predators might move among us, hidden behind facades of normalcy and even virtue. Equally disturbing is what their case reveals about the vulnerabilities of frontier society. A world where transience was normal, where strangers were taken at face value, where disappearances could be attributed to the countless hazards of wilderness travel. The Blackwood sisters exploited these conditions masterfully, creating a perfect mechanism for identifying, isolating, and eliminating their chosen victims. Their methodology anticipated aspects of modern serial killing by decades. The careful selection of victims, the maintenance of detailed records, the disposal methods designed to prevent discovery, and, perhaps most notably, the creation of a controlled environment where they held complete power. These elements would reappear in numerous cases throughout the 20th century, leading some criminologists to suggest that the Blackwoods may have inadvertently created a template for future predators. The site where Blackwood House once stood is now unmarked farmland, the exact location lost to time and deliberate obscurity. County officials, concerned about macabre tourism, have never placed historical markers at the site. The road that once connected Fort Scott to the Oklahoma territories has long since been rerouted, and the bend in the Marmaton River, where travelers once sought lodging for the night, has been altered by decades of flooding and erosion. All that remains are the records, the ledger with its chilling entries, the correspondence that revealed their motivations, and the lingering questions about those who might have crossed paths with the sisters after their escape. For travelers in the American Northeast in the late 19th century, particularly those in the business of speculation and investment, the advice eventually became clear. Avoid establishments run by unmarried women of a certain age, particularly those who seemed overly interested in your travel plans and whether anyone expected your arrival elsewhere. Such caution may seem discriminatory by modern standards, but for those who knew the story of the Blackwood sisters, it represented a potentially life-saving precaution. The final known reference to the Blackwood case appeared in a Montreal newspaper in 1895, when a retiring police detective gave an interview regarding unsolved cases that still troubled him. He mentioned investigating a boarding house run by two American spinsters after several business travelers had disappeared without trace. When questioned about their establishment, the women had promptly sold their property and vanished overnight. What disturbed me most, the detective was quoted as saying, was finding a small ledger hidden in their parlor desk. It contained names and dates, each marked with either a P or an R. When I realized what those letters likely stood for, I felt a chill I have never since been able to shake. But by then, the women were gone, as completely as if they had never existed at all. Whether these women were indeed the Blackwood sisters cannot be conclusively proven, but the methodology matches their established pattern. If this account is accurate, it suggests they remained active for at least 20 years after their initial crimes in Kansas, potentially claiming dozens more victims. The legacy of the Blackwood sisters exists now primarily as a footnote in the study of frontier criminality and female serial killers, subjects that remain relatively unexplored compared to their male counterparts. Yet their case offers valuable insight into how such predators could exploit the transient nature of frontier society and the limited communication between communities to carry out prolonged campaigns of calculated murder. For those who study criminal psychology, the Blackwood sisters represent a rare documented case of mission-oriented female killers operating with business-like efficiency rather than passion or desperation. Their apparent belief in the righteousness of their cause, eliminating those they deemed harmful to society, allowed them to kill repeatedly without apparent psychological deterioration. The question that haunts researchers to this day is not just how many victims the sisters claimed, but how many similar predators might have operated in the margins of history, their crimes undiscovered or misattributed, their patterns never identified, their motives never understood. As for the Blackwood sisters themselves, they ultimately achieved what many criminals only dream of: complete disappearance, new identities, and possibly decades of freedom after their crimes were discovered. Whether they eventually died peacefully of natural causes or met more violent ends remains unknown. Their graves, if they exist, bear names other than Blackwood, final aliases in lives defined by deception and calculated violence. The last word on the case might best be attributed to Dr. Thomas Mercer, the historian who first uncovered many of the documents that brought the Blackwood case back to public attention in the 1960s. In his final academic paper on the subject, published shortly before his death in 1968, he wrote, "What disturbs us most about the Blackwood sisters is not merely what they did, but how easily they did it. They created a perfect trap on the frontier, a place where travelers were expected to appear and disappear with regularity, where questions were considered impolite, where the missing might not be missed for weeks or months. They exploited the very openness and mobility that defined American society in that era. And most troubling of all, when their crimes were discovered, they simply moved elsewhere and likely continued, adapting their methods to new circumstances but maintaining their fundamental purpose. One cannot help but wonder if their descendants walk among us still, having inherited not just their blood, but their unique perspective on justice and retribution. For some family traditions, like some stains, run too deep to ever truly wash away. Whether the Blackwood bloodline truly continued remains speculative. No confirmed descendants have ever been identified, though rumors persist of a niece who may have joined them after their escape from custody. What is certain is that their methodology, their calculated approach to identifying, isolating, and eliminating their chosen victims, created a template that would be repeated by other predators throughout history. And so, the legacy of the Blackwood sisters, the women who never served the same guest twice, lives on not just in historical records, but in the persistent caution against strangers who take too keen an interest in one's travels, one's connections, and whether anyone might come looking if one were to disappear. In the words attributed to Eliza Blackwood's final letter, "We have simply become the consequence they never expected to face. And we remain vigilant," a warning that, even after all these years, retains its power to disturb.